I go into my closing argument, I just want to touch on a couple things that Mr. Satz said. For almost an hour of Mr. Satz's opening statement, he talked about everything that Nikolas did on February 14, 2018, in detail. He walked you down the halls that you walked down, and he showed you the videos that he has shown you several times. And that day, Nikolas did exactly what he said he was going to do. And we have never said that he didn't do that. He has never said that he didn't do that. What he did has never been in dispute. This phase of the trial, of the proceedings, is not about accountability. Because when Nikolas pled on October 20th, 2021, he was found accountable. The decision that has to be made by each of you individually is how he should be punished. Nikolas knew the difference between right and wrong that day. And he chose wrong. And we know that because he pled to 17 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. Yes, he planned what he was going to do on February 14th. And he pled to that, and he accepted responsibility for that. Choosing to kill is not an aggravating factor. It is not for your consideration when you are making your decision about whether or not he should live or die. He chose to kill, and he chose to plead guilty to those charges. Mr. Satz also spoke about the drug screens that Brenda took. And one that seems to be particularly important is the drug screen that was done from the meconium. And we call Dr. Scully, seems like forever ago, but she was the pharmacologist. That's the only thing that Dr. Scully does. And she reviewed all those records, and what did she tell us? She told us that she literally contacted the lab, went over the drug screen form, talked about the test that was actually administered, and what did the lab tell her? That it wasn't a sensitive test. The state also told you that Brenda passed every single drug test. Well, we know she passed the first drug test, which put her on notice that every time she went to the doctor, appointments that she scheduled, she would be drug tested. So what do we know? For 4 months, Brenda didn't go back to the doctor. She was off the grid. She was roaming the streets. She was selling her body. She was smoking crack. And she was drinking alcohol. And then eventually she gets placed on probation, so we know probation does some testing. We don't have any results from probation. Those records no longer exist. So we really don't know if she tested positive when she went to probation twice. Another important fact about that meconium that Mr. Satz spoke about is that it was actually collected 22 hours after Nikolas was born. And we know from the testimony of Mrs. Scully, Dr. Scully, that if there's drugs or alcohol, it isn't necessarily evenly distributed throughout the fluid. Was she smoking crack? How long was she smoking crack? You get to make that decision. Who do you believe? But what we do know with 100% certainty is that not one of those tests that Brenda took ever tested for alcohol. Mr. Satz spoke to you about the DCF call, and I will touch on it in my statement, but there's a couple things I'd like to point out. And I, like Mr. Satz, encourage you to read every single document, everything that is in evidence, which means all of this, if you so choose. And if there's a particular document, excuse me, that an attorney referenced, or a witness referenced, or a doctor believed was important in forming their opinion, you can ask us for that, and we can pull it for you. But they're here. This is Nikolas's life, if you want to read anything. And I encourage you, and I'll point out a couple things, just like Mr. Satz did with the DCF report. To give you some context for this DCF report, and there's bait stamps on the pages, so if there's something particular you'd like to look at, this is DCF 1 of 22. It's the same thing that Mr. Satz showed you. But what I'd like to point out is why this call happened in the first place. And we talked about it, and you heard some testimony. Excuse me. That there was some issues that Nikolas was having at school, and that several people had evaluated him for a Baker Act. 4 people, in fact, and one of them refused, which was the school resource officer, Scott Peterson. But what do we also know? That school social worker, who licensed by the state of Florida, was able to Baker Act someone. She had the license to do it. But the school district has a law or a rule or a policy that actually says the school social workers are not allowed to Baker Act the students. So the actual licensed professionals at a school, they're not allowed to do it. But she encouraged the school resource officer to. And then she called Henderson, that came out to MSD, an intern, being supervised. And that didn't happen, right? So that school social worker called the Department of Children and Family. They have an abuse hotline, because she wanted something done. Nothing was being done. This kid wanted to buy a gun. There was allegations that he was cutting. There was allegations that he was drinking alcohol. His mother was not concerned that he wanted to buy a gun. So she called the Department of Children and Family, and at this time, Nikolas was 18 years old. So the designation that Nikolas got as being a mentally ill, vulnerable adult, that was given to him by the Department of Children and Family. That's a designation based on a call. The purpose of the call, and it's all here, and it talks about some of the things that I just said to you about the school, was to do a risk level assessment. Because that school social worker was concerned about what was going on in that house. So they went to the house, and they talked to Linda Cruz, and they talked to Nikolas Cruz, and the Department of Children and Family found, and it's in here, in their risk level assessment, no implications for his safety. He resides with his mother, and he's receiving in-home services. So the designation of him being a vulnerable, mentally ill adult did not go away. Please read this report. They just said that the current situation that he was in, he wasn't at risk. 3 days later, 3 days later, Nikolas Cruz did exactly what that school social worker was so terrified about. What she told everybody frightened her. He bought his first gun, a rifle. Days, literally days after being designated a vulnerably mentally ill adult by the Department of Children and Family. You know, it's funny, and it's kind of ironic in this case, specifically with Linda and the impressions that she liked to give people, the facade that she liked to present. But living in a 4,500 square foot house in Parkland, this house, and this is already in evidence, doesn't mean that you have a good life. It doesn't mean that when you open the door and you walk in, that everything is okay. And we know that, right? Because we have all of these records, including Camelot Community Care. And that counselor, Amanda Brown, you know how she described this beautiful 45 square foot house? When she opened the door and she looked in, she described it as a war zone. A war zone. And we know from the testimony of lots and lots of records and some of the Henderson providers, and these are in evidence, this is the inside of that 45,000 square foot house. And you have these pictures, so when you get closer, you'll see that Linda has patched all the holes in the house that Zachary and Nikolas punched. Not a lot of furniture, right? Kids destroyed all that. When you get this photo, you can look closer that they had Berber carpet. And the records tell you that both Zach and Nikolas unwound the carpet, so she just left concrete. We know that Steve Sinkoff in his record said that I had to take her to Faith Farm to try and get her some furniture. Broken glass doors. And this one is particularly interesting. This is the photograph of Nikolas's and Zachary's bathroom. And when you get this photo, and you're able to see it up close, you'll see that right across from the toilet are patched marks, right? And you will know, if you review the Henderson records in episode 2, that this was one of the things that his therapist, Jared Benningfield, tried to work on with Nikolas, because he would get so frustrated, he would sit on the toilet with a knife and just strike through the drywall. This isn't a 4,500 square foot house where everything was happy. We know that. The evidence tells us that. Please do not be misled by square footage and geographical locations of a home.